Hi, and welcome to the 84th in our series on Middle Eastern history. Today, we're going to focus on the modern Caucasus, primarily covering the Southern Caucasus, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. And for those of you who are unfamiliar, these are the rules. This is not an academic presentation. I'm not accredited in history, religion, philosophy, or any of the topics that we are going to be discussing tonight. I'm going to approach this as a layperson, and I'm going to try and approach this from a secular perspective, meaning that I'm not going to try and favor any side, but rather try to explain the story as it's been happening. And of course, this topic, like every other topic in the Middle East, is controversial, so let's be respectful. That said, I love interactivity. Questions, comments, clarifications, please put those in the chat. I do read the chat and will respond in real time. This presentation, I like to say, is a 101 and a 201, meaning that if you don't know anything, I'll be sure to catch you up. And if you already know something, I'll probably still tell you something you didn't know. I'm also going to have a 2-hour hard stop, which means that at 9 p.m. Eastern time, whatever I haven't gotten to, that's okay. I'll just go to the Q&A and we can ask our questions, and whatever I didn't cover, we'll roll into next week. When I put dates below a person, typically if they are a political figure, those dates will be when they were in power. If it's a thought leader, that's going to be their entire life. And this, like the other 83 episodes in the Middle Eastern History series and all the other series that you can see on our YouTube channel, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, will be recorded, and you can see all the episodes in series. And you can also go back, for example, to episode 49, which is our episode on the Caucasian Wars, if you want more discussion about what happened during World War I and in the aftermath. And if you want to be part of the Zoom, so that way you can ask your questions and be part of the process, please join our meetup. And if you join our meetup, you will be able to see all of our different events as they're happening. We also will continue to provide these presentations for free, but if you think that the work that we're doing on Zoom, YouTube, meetup, all of which cost us some premiums, is something that's worthwhile, please donate and help us keep the roof on over our heads. All right. As we remember, the Caucasus was actually a Middle Eastern region. And you can see that it wasn't until the 1800s that Iran really lost control of the majority of the South Caucasus. And the only parts that weren't under their control, which is Western Georgia, had historically been part of the Ottoman Empire. So for me, I find it very strange that people try to cut off these regions from the Caucasus. Now, of course, they have a lot of relationships with Russia, and that has defined their policies to a very strong extent. But you've had colonialism and imperialism in other parts of the Middle East as well, and that doesn't stop them from being Middle Eastern countries. And we also should notice that the borders of the Caucasian countries are not necessarily the ones that they necessarily had to have. You can see, for example, the various gubernia or governorates that existed during the early Russian period. And these are different from those that exist today, and the countries are divided somewhat differently. We've also talked about, when we're looking at the Caucasus, that the Caucasus is a very diverse region. In fact, it's probably the most diverse region in the world. It has 5 major language families that exist very close together. Of course, you have the Indo-European family, of which Armenian and Persian and several other smaller languages like Ossetian and Talysh are members. You have Turkish languages like Turkish and Azeri. But you also have several different Caucasian families. You have Abkhaz, you have Adigay, you have Georgian, which is considered Caucasian as well. And you have a number of these other different families. Many of these languages are spoken by fewer than 100,000 people. But of course, the larger languages like Georgian is spoken by 4 million. Azeri is spoken by close to 9 million. So you have a wide amount of variation here. And you also have a wide variation in historic dress and customs. We've talked about how, for example, Georgia used to be a large empire. especially just prior to the Mongol invasion, you had Queen Tamar, who went by the title of king, because Georgian doesn't make distinctions between male and female monarchs. So the name has always been translated as King Tamar, and who was able to unite almost all of the Caucasus directly or indirectly under her rule. You also have the continual contest between the Ottoman Empire and Persia for control of the Caucasus. In fact, the Battle of Chaldiran in 1514 secured Ottoman control of the vast bulk of the Caucasus for quite a while, until it was won back by in several other campaigns. We should also remember that Caucasians have been disproportionately important outside of the Caucasus. Here we see the Kurchi, which were the Turkic nomads from both Azerbaijan and Iranian Azerbaijan, who were the critical fighting force in the Safavid Empire, and we talked about them more in that episode. I think that's episode 20. We've also talked about, for example, the Georgian Mamluks in Iraq, which ruled during the 1700s and 1800s as a vassal state of the Ottoman, as a vassal or suzerain state of the Ottoman Empire. And of course, the North Caucasians, like the Circassians, were part of the Mamluk dynasty of Egypt. So you have all these different Caucasians who are leaving their region, usually as slaves and captives, but they're taken as military slaves and military captives, so they begin to have a role there. One of the common threads that we see with regards to the Caucasus is the theme of deportation, forced relocation, and resettlement of communities as the wars rage. And this is one of the older cases, but it's very illustrative. When Shah Abbas was fighting against the Ottomans in what is today Nakhchivan, Azerbaijan, he wanted to, as he was retreating, remove everything so the Ottomans wouldn't have anything to eat and their supply lines would be overextended. And so the city of Julfa in that region was thoroughly depopulated. It was an Armenian majority city, and the Armenians were forced to march back with Shah Abbas's troops all the way to Isfahan. Now, of course, this was not a case where there was ample food provided and where the river was properly forded and where everything was thought of in advance. In fact, over half of the Armenians who were on that march did not make it to Isfahan. Those that did ended up settling a district of the city called Nur Julfa, after the old city, and have created the community of Iranian Armenians that continues to this day. But this forcible deportation was just one of many. And of course, Georgians were also deported. There are about 200,000 Georgians that were also deported in these withdrawals by Shah Abbas. The consistency of these deportations also show the lack of agency, and we're going to see that as a general theme as well, that a lot of Caucasians have in the goings-on of their own politics because of their larger, much more powerful neighbors that are continually influencing their situation. Within the Ottoman Empire, the Armenians had lacked political power for a significant period of time. They lacked that also in the Safavid Empire. But their people were represented primarily through their religion. And so the Armenians clung to the church as a marker of both identity and organization. And so the island of Akhtamar, which sits within Lake Van, was seen as one of the centers of the Armenian Patriarchate. Other centers, of course, being like Echmiadzin. And Akhtamar had one Catholicos, or one universal leader, and that Catholicos would be responsible for the Armenian community and preside over Armenian rituals. We also have conflicts that occur during this vassal period between the various different groups indigenous to the region without necessarily outside spurring. One of these in particular was the sack of Shamachi, which occurred during the larger Russian invasion of what is today Azerbaijan. But this particular region was a situation where there was a confluence of factors between the Georgians, like King Vakhtang of Kartli being an eastern region of Georgia, and Haji Daoud of the Lezgians, leading to attacks on the Shiite Muslims of Azerbaijan because Haji Daoud was Sunni and King Vakhtang was Georgian Orthodox Christian. You can see more about that war here. One of the points that's really important to make, because as we get closer and closer to the present, is actually how the question of Armenian statehood existed historically. And as I mentioned, within the Ottoman Empire, the Armenians lacked any sort of political apparatus. Their apparatus was the church. And we've seen that within the Persian Empire, the Armenians had very little political power to assert themselves, which is why they were forcibly deported to Isfahan. But there was one area of those Caucasian states that was a suzerain of the Safavids that was relatively independent, and relatively being that stronger word there. And those are the 5 melikdoms, also known as Khachen, and these names exist at different periods of time. But these small kingdoms, or melikdoms, exist within a mountainous region that has historically been called Karabakh, or the Black Gardens. And so these were areas where Armenians had their own political authority, and that political authority survived until midway through the 19th century. One of the things to point out is that while there was a strong degree of ethnic unity, you also have cases where a person of one ethnicity will turn on members of their ethnicity in order to achieve a larger benefit for themselves or some other objective. You can see Shah Nazar II of Varanda made a deal with Pana Ali Khan Javanshir of Karabakh, of Lower Karabakh, in order to help him bring mountainous Karabakh into the larger area. And it's worth pointing out that the mountainous area, right, the 5 melikdoms, was controlled primarily by Armenians, and the lowlands of Karabakh that surround them have overwhelming Azerbaijani majorities. So we also have a situation that Georgia was deeply divided in this period. And in fact, the unification of Georgia that exists today as one entity is really a direct result of the fact that the Russians united all of it when they took it as a protectorate in 1802. And I really like this map here, because this map here sort of shows the quantity of little statelets and the various sovereignties that each one had relative to a major core or one of its nearby adversaries. And the Treaty of Georgievsk basically brought Georgia within the Russian ambit. First, Kartli Kakheti becoming an ally of Russia, and then later Solomonov Imreti and other Georgians were forced to surrender to the Russians as well. We then, of course, have the Russo-Persian Wars, where the Russians take control of the region. First with the Treaty of Gulistan, which secures the majority of what's today Azerbaijan, the eastern part of Georgia, and parts of Armenia. And we also have, and we also later have the Treaty of Turkmenchai, which takes the rest of the South Caucasus. Now, we should be clear that the Russian occupation was not perceived as some kind of liberation or some kind of civilizing mission from the people that were being conquered. It was certainly viewed that way by the Russians themselves, but the people who were being conquered were very resistant to Russian control. And so many of the Russian generals began to become more and more abrasive, especially to the larger ethnic groups that exist. Particularly nasty example, where he said that I desire that the terror of my name shall guard our frontiers more potentially than chains or fortresses. And he repeatedly executed women and children in order to send messages to those who would refuse Russian orders. He also abolished a number of the khanates that had existed under Tatar rule, like Sheki Karabakh and Shirvan. And so the fight for the Caucasus on the Russian side was a long, drawn-out campaign. And of course, if you want to know more about this part, I would encourage you to watch episode 27, which covers the Russian expansion into the Caucasus in an incredible amount of detail. But the point here is that those Caucasians that the Russians couldn't control, they expelled. And those they could control, they repressed anyway. And the Russians, after signing the Treaty of Turkmenchai in 1828, realized they needed an ethnic group upon whom they could rely, an ethnic group that would be willing to support the expansion of Russian power to the south side of the Caucasus. And so, upon conquering Erivan Khanate, which was a majority Muslim region, it was 80% Persian and Turkish, they began to provide incentives for Armenians to immigrate. And there were numerous waves over the course of the late 1800s and early 1900s that Armenians began to immigrate to Erivan Khanate. Now, some may come with the supposition that these were foreign interlopers, in the sense of they had no purpose of being on that land, but that was far from the case. Erivan Khanate had been one of the historic territories of Armenia, stretching back about 2,000 to 3,000 years. And in fact, the city Yerevan itself was originally called Erebuni and built by the Armenian kings. So there was certainly Armenian history in the region. It's just that they were no longer the majority because of all of the forcible deportations that we've alluded to earlier. And so by the end of the 19th century, certainly by the beginning of the 20th century, Armenians were the majority in the former territories of Erivan Khanate, even though the number in raw terms of Persians and Turks within the region increased. As we've mentioned when talking about the Russian Balkan Wars, the Russian-Ottoman Wars, such as the War of 1877, on the eastern flank, as Russia was invading the Ottoman Empire into what's today southern Georgia and into eastern Turkey, all the way to Erzurum, four of the Russian generals that led the charge, like Hovhannes Darle-Lazarian, were Armenians fighting under the Russian banner. And this shows how close that those two ethnic groups had seen each other even as early as 1877. Remember, Treaty of Turkmenchai was 1828, so this is around 50 years later. And as we're going to see very painfully, there were numerous massacres throughout the Russo-Turkish War of 1877, including in this region. In particular, you have Armenians fleeing Kurds in what is today Turkey. You have Muslim minorities fleeing the Russian advance. All of these kinds of groups. And as we can see from the Russian Empire only conducted one major census in the South Caucasus that we are familiar with, and that's the census of 1897. But the census of 1897 was incredibly specific. So we have lots of really great data as to who was where and how many and what did they want and all these kinds of things. And there's sort of two things that I want to draw as points from this. The first one is that the Georgians seem pretty concentrated, and the majority is in most provinces. That said, there were numerous provinces, including Tbilisi, where Georgians were not the majority, they were a plurality, meaning that they're the highest percentage, just not over 50%. And the reason that they were a plurality in the region of Tbilisi is that the city itself was majority Armenian. And Baku itself, the capital of what would become Azerbaijan, also had a significant Armenian population. Conversely, you had Azerbaijanis throughout eastern Georgia and in Armenia as well. And the same with Georgians throughout the regions. And never mind, of course, other minorities that exist in the South Caucasus, like the Talysh, who exist in that southernmost region of Azerbaijan that's also just a Turkic plurality. And we can also see that the Armenification of Erivan Khanat had been largely successful because the area around Lake Sevan is majority Armenian. And most of the areas around it are plurality Armenian anyway. The one thing that sort of catches most people's eye is that gray region that's completely surrounded by red. And that is, of course, Nagorno-Karabakh, where there's an Armenian plurality because part of the region that that particular government occupies is in lowland Karabakh, which is more heavily populated. And you can see here, Karabakh, of course, also receiving immigrants from Persia. So as we move into the late 19th century, we begin to see Armenians beginning to manifest their own symbols of independence, rallying behind the Dashnaq Sutyun, or the Armenian Revolutionary Federation. And this group, was, just one second. And this group was desiring increased Armenian independence and better organization as they moved into the new century. Nationalism had begun to spread, especially because of the rise of Turkish nationalism within the Ottoman Empire. And the contest between Armenians and the Ottomans, of course, started in 1894 with the Hamidian massacres. These were massacres in response to Armenian protests for increased freedoms and more equality. Things like, for example, that an Armenian's testimony in court would be equal to a Turk's, and other similar issues that they were facing. And of course, I discussed much more about this in, I believe, episode 43. And so you begin to have these Armenian movements existing within the Ottoman Empire, and these begin to also spread into Russia, because, of course, the Russians were, in many cases, supporting these Armenian movements in order to destabilize the Ottoman Empire, as the two countries had been arch rivals. In fact, Aram Mamikonian, who was the first major leader of the Dashnatsutyun, the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, was himself based in Russia in order to coordinate more effectively. And it should not surprise us that when World War I occurred, the Russians seized upon the opportunity in order to invade the Ottoman Empire. And one thing that should be painfully obvious is how difficult it is for the Ottomans to defend the territory that they're holding in the northeast, because they have no railroads that go there. All their railroads connect areas in Europe or areas in the west or in the south. None of them go further east, and so everything needed to come from horses or other modes of transportation, which were incredibly inefficient. And General Yudenich from the Russian side relied heavily on Armenian volunteers to help push the forces forward. You have battles like Sarıkamış, which was a massive Russian victory over the Ottoman forces, and this leads many on the CUP, meaning the Committee of Union and Progress, the ruling party of the Ottoman Empire, to see the Armenians as the reason why Sarıkamış was lost. And we talk a lot more about that in our World War I episodes. That's 43 all the way to 47. As long as the Russians were advancing, things looked relatively good for the Armenians. But of course, that is within the areas that the Russians controlled. Outside of those territories, the Armenians were subject to large-scale deportations and genocide. And again, we've talked about this more in depth there. But the point that we need to take away from this is not the specificity of what happened, but the cultural memory that it left for many Armenians and how they began to understand their relationship with the Turkish majority of Anatolia, which is to say that they could never see them as partners or long-term benefactors. And in fact, we're going to see repeated actions that further reinforce this fear and this sentiment. And one of the aspects of the Armenian genocide that we don't often talk about, beyond the forced marches into the desert that you saw on the previous presentation, and that you can see below on the left-hand side, was that there were numerous laws passed that made protecting Armenians to be illegal. There were the Tashkilat-e Mahsusa, or the special organization, which was a group of thugs that harassed the Armenian population as they were moving. Women were often marked with certain tattoos to indicate that they were either owned or that they had been physically assaulted in a way that they would carry a new Turkish child. There were a lot of different aspects that went into the genocide, far beyond simply marching people out into the desert. And by the way, for those who always ask, there were concentration camps out in the desert, but they did the primary function of concentrating, and they weren't death camps. The death was simply due to exhaustion and lack of resources. Now, the situation changed fundamentally when the Russian Tsardom collapsed, and the Russians abandoned their war against the Ottoman Empire. Now, if we're going to be very specific, when the Russians gave up, the Kerensky government continued the war, but Lenin, when he took power, ended the war. And so those positions began to collapse to Turkish control. A number of local Armenians and Georgians wanted to try and take control of those territories themselves, and they did so by creating different independent groups. In particular, you had the Ozakom, or the Trans-Caucasian Commissariat, which tried to sign a separate peace with the Ottoman Empire and create a new type of governance system. As you can see from this map, the Russians ceded control of the Trans-Caucasus to a German sphere following the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Of course, the Germans never actually were able to capitalize on that in any meaningful way. The Germans did have good relations with the Georgians, but they weren't able to capitalize because, of course, they lost World War I about a year later. So we then have invasions from the Ottoman Empire trying to assert power in the South Caucasus through the creation of a pan-Islamist army. But eventually, you have the Trans-Caucasian Federation. And this all we discuss in episode 49. But the point that is important to make here is that the Georgians, Armenians, and Azerbaijanis tried to create a federative republic. They tried to create a unified government. And the hilariousness of how difficult that was is you can see in the Trabzon Peace Conference, where they tried to sue for peace with the Ottomans. They had to have, that is simply the delegation from the Trans-Caucasian Democratic Federative Republic, because every ethnicity needs to be represented in exactly the proportions that represented their population, in order to prevent the sense that a certain ethnicity or other was not being properly represented. And in fact, if you look at the parliament, it's divided into about a third for others, about a quarter for Georgian Mensheviks, a quarter for Musavat, which was the Azerbaijani political party, and about 1/6 for the Dashnaks, which is the Armenian political party. Now, one of the things that I want to point out about the Azerbaijan Democratic Republic in this period is we can see here that they control Zangezur, or as the Armenians call it, Syunik region, which is what connects Armenia today to Iran. And so in many cases, the territories that they were claiming were not territories that they naturally held. And Azerbaijan today no longer claims that region, because the Armenians were able to take it over prior to the Soviet invasion of the region. So Andrei Nikozanian, who you can see there, conquered the region and was going to conquer the Nagorno-Karabakh region, but the British convinced him not to, saying that they would award it to Armenia anyway, and they didn't. In Baku, you had a very interesting situation. There was the Trans-Caucasian Commissariat, or the Baku Commune, and the Baku Commune was a communist entity built by Soviet supporter Stepan Shahumyan in Baku itself. Shahumyan, of course, was Armenian. And the commune was eventually overthrown, and its leaders executed in Ashgabat, which is in modern-day Turkmenistan. And during the communist period, there was actually a memorial in Baku to these 26 commissars who were executed, which Azerbaijan removed when it became independent, because it considered these to be it to be a break with the Soviet past, as well as the break with an Armenian leader in Baku. And of course, this is going to establish a theme that we're going to see periodically, which is that Azerbaijan will remove references to Armenia or Armenian history or things that perceive to be related to Armenians within the territory of Azerbaijan. So after the armistice at Mudros, you begin to have um, an attempt by the Allied powers to establish relations with the Transcaucasian countries. And that comes amidst those Transcaucasian countries breaking up. There was the Federation, and now it's breaking up into an independent Georgia run by Noez Jordania, who is a Menshevik. And you have the Musavat party in Azerbaijan and the Dashnaks ruling Armenia. And you also have other groups like separated by Zangezur under Armenian control. You have Nakhchivan coming independent under Turkic mini-state called Aras. Now, Nakhchivan is a unique region in that it is fully separated by land from Azerbaijan, but it has an Azerbaijani majority, a slight majority at this period, a complete majority now. And the Armenians make up the Armenians at that time made up a significant minority. The next thing to sort of look at is, as I mentioned, the British said that they would grant Armenians control of Karabakh. But that ended up not being the case. The British saw more eye to eye with the Azerbaijanis and felt that they were a more effective partner than they did the Armenians. And so they were willing to give the Azerbaijanis control. In fact, the region around Karabakh fell to a man named Khosrow Bey Sultanov. And Sultanov was known particularly for wanting to extend Azerbaijani power more thoroughly into this region. He was responsible for undoing the mixed administrative administrative councils, and he helped perpetrate the Khay Balikend massacre, in which 600 to 700 Armenians murdered. There were, of course, also skirmishes where Armenians killed Azerbaijanis throughout the region. But by and large, the Armenians lacked the political power to assert themselves in this period. Now, Sultanov was unable to convince the communists, when the communists came in, that he was sympathetic to their aims, and ended up having to live in exile in Turkey afterwards. But his view of trying to control the Armenians and trying to control their territory, especially when it came to Nagorno-Karabakh, was something that deeply impacted the way Armenians saw their relationship with the Azerbaijanis. On the flip side, the Azerbaijanis believed that those borders that had been established, especially as later codified by the Soviets, were somehow sacrosanct. And so the territories that are part of Azerbaijan should be under Azerbaijani control, as Sultanov tried to do. And so in many ways, the Azerbaijani state is trying to finish what Sultanov started. As I mentioned, the Armenians were expelled from the city of Shusha. And then the freezing of these conflicts happened. So Chicherin, who was a Soviet foreign minister, began to reach out to the various leaders within the various Soviet republics and saw Azerbaijan as the weakest of the three and launched a direct invasion of Baku, which fell on the 20th of August, 1920. And when it fell, he made it into a Soviet client state and then proceeded to turn his troops around to Armenia. Armenia itself was in the middle of a war with Turkey, and that war was not going particularly well for the Armenians. So, in order to be able to prevent a full-scale genocide, as many Armenians were afraid that the Republic of Turkey was going to do, and General Karabekir was not making it difficult for those Armenians to feel any differently. In fact, when he took the city of Kars from what was Wilstonian Armenia, many of the Armenians fled, and he continued to pursue them. And so the Armenians under Hamazas Ohanjanyan, decided to sign the Treaty of Gyumri, which effectively ceded a significant amount of territory to Turkey that had previously been part of Armenia, and at the same time allow Armenia to become part of the Soviet Union, preventing the Turks from overwhelming them. Now, there were Armenians who were unwilling to accept this treaty with the Turks and with the Soviets. And so you have the creation of the Republic of Mountainous Armenia in the southern part of what is today Armenia by Garagin Nejde. And in many cases, a lot of what we can see as the Armenian desire to take back their land sort of comes out of this kind of nationalism that Nejde sort of symbolizes. And when he controlled that area of Syunik region, he expelled the Azerbaijani population, forcing them to flee in many cases to areas in Lower Karabakh. The Soviets couldn't find a compelling reason to invade Georgia until Orjokonikidze, who was a Georgian in the Soviet Politburo, created a false flag operation at Shaumiani in Georgia that would force the Soviet Union to defend itself against the Georgians. And that ultimately resulted in a Soviet victory over Georgia, despite the ramifications of violating a recognized state's sovereignty. So by 1920 and 1921, the Soviet Union included Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, and the border with Turkey was settled in the Treaty of Kars. And then within the Soviet framework, you have the creation of Soviet Socialist republics, and then below them you have autonomous Soviet Socialist republics. These are entities that have almost completely their own governance. And you have autonomous oblasts, which are a level below that, which is that they have a certain degree of autonomy, but they don't have anything close to the level of autonomy that a Soviet Socialist republic, an autonomous Soviet Socialist republic has. And you can see from this map that Abkhazia, Adjaria, and Nakhchivan were given that rank of ASSR, and that South Ossetia and Nagorno-Karabakh were given that rank of autonomous oblast. The states that became the Soviet Socialist republics, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, retained that role because they had been independent prior to being incorporated in the Soviet Union. And this situation survived in one form or another through most of the Soviet period, because Russia was able to basically suppress all of the ethnic tensions, all of the ethnic rivalries that existed in this region. Of course, during the Soviet period, there were also attempts in dealing with this region. For example, there was a British intended operation to bomb the oil fields in Baku. There was Operation Edelweiss, which was stopped in the northern Caucasus. And of course, many Caucasians were directly conscripted in the Soviet army. The Soviet army tended to prioritize non-Russian citizens of the empire. And in fact, 400,000 Georgians fought in World War II. A smaller number of Armenians and Azerbaijanis also fought. So as we get towards the end, sorry, and of course, it should go without saying that during the Cold War, as part of the Soviet Union, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan were part of the overall communist world. And their border with Turkey was one of the points of friction between the free world and the communist world, the capitalist world and the communist world, as seen during the Cold War. That said, that border ended up remaining relatively peaceful throughout the Cold War, because the Soviet attempts to invade Turkey were rebuffed by Turkey's joining of NATO, and Turkey knew that it couldn't directly engage the Soviet Union. And so the situation fundamentally changed during the reign of Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the last premier of the Soviet Union. He ruled from 1985 to 1991. And when he ruled, he employed two major programs: Glasnost, which was his permission for increased freedoms of speech and of the press, and Perestroika, which was his movement to revitalize the economy. In the case of the Caucasus, Glasnost was far more important because it allowed a lot of the ethnic tensions that had previously existed at sort of a low level to become much more prevalent. In particular, you have the protests that begin to develop in the Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast. Now, if we look at this ethnic map from the early 1980s, we can see in red the Armenian communities and in green the Azerbaijani communities. And the region was split roughly 3/4 Armenian, 1/4 Azerbaijani, and that Azerbaijani number had been increasing steadily throughout the Soviet period because this was part of Azerbaijan, and there were concerted movements by various Azerbaijani leaders to increase the Azerbaijani population in the territory. That said, the overwhelming majority was still Armenian, and protests in Stepanakert in 1988 were pushing for what Armenian Politburo members had been pushing for since the 1930s, which was the incorporation of Nagorno-Karabakh into the state of Armenia and removing it from the state of Azerbaijan. And Azerbaijan disagreed with these protests, arguing that Nagorno-Karabakh would be a territory of Azerbaijan and they would be entitled to all of their cultural rights as long as they stayed within the Azerbaijani fold. From the Armenian perspective, they had already tried that. Khosrow Bey Sultanov had agreed that they would have their cultural distinctiveness, and then proceeded to not honor that. Additionally, with the increasingly Azerbaijani nationalist views that were beginning to circulate in Baku, such a recognition seemed less and less acceptable. And so these protests are eventually tamped down by the 20th of February 1988, and not a week after that, you have a large-scale pogrom against Armenians in the Baku suburb of Sumgait. These kinds of massacres that were followed by retaliatory massacres on the Armenian side against Azerbaijanis and so forth began to escalate tensions between the Armenians and Azerbaijanis. Now, for the sake of clarity, I'm going to use the term Armenian at this point because most of the Armenians flee Azerbaijan relatively early on. Those Armenians who are in the territory of the Republic of Armenia, I'm going to call Armenians. Those that are in the Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast, I'm going to call by the name of the republic that now occupies the territory, which is the Republic of Artsakh. So I'm going to call those Artsakis. But Artsakis and Armenians are both Armenian ethnically. They're just different politically. So you begin to have increasing antipathy, especially between the Artsakis in Stepanakert and the Azerbaijanis in Shusha, and you have retaliatory massacres on both sides. You also have increasing pushes for independence in Georgia. 1 year later, in April of 1989, a protest in Tbilisi results in an attack from the Russian government. From the Soviet government trying to put down the protest, and that is called the Tbilisi tragedy. This begins to inspire Georgians to seek more and more independence through a nationalist lens. And that nationalist aspiration worries the Abkhaz in Abkhazia, that they would become subject to Georgian whims as opposed to a larger Soviet situation. And so at the city of Likhne, on the 18th of March, they begin to have their own appeals for independence. And that not just independence from, and not actually independence from the Soviet Union. In fact, they'd prefer to be a part of the Soviet Union, but independence from Georgia. They would no longer be an autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic in union with Georgia. They would be something different in union with Russia. And I mentioned before that both of these countries both Armenia and Azerbaijan began to expel the population of the other. And you can see in both on the map all the expulsions of Armenians from Azerbaijan, and on the right the numbers of our Azerbaijanis in Armenia, which basically tanks following 1979, showing that they were expelled rather than leaving, presumably by choice. And in many of these cases, these have resulted in effectively mono-ethnic regions where previously you had significant amounts of diversity. And of course, from a human rights perspective, this is an absolute disaster in terms of the number of people who've been relocated, the amount of people whose lives have been shaken up. It's estimated that around 1.5 million people on either side have lost their homes, many of them unable to return to those places as a result of the various conflicts. There's a question here. Maybe one can shed light on the relationship between Georgia, Armenia, and Russia. It's sometimes hard to keep straight. The relationship between Georgia and Russia is generally one of moderate antagonism. It's especially under the Georgian Dream Party, which has pulled closer to Russia than Saakashvili's United National Movement. But Russia has generally used the regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia in order to maintain a certain degree of control over Georgian policy and to push Georgia around a little bit more than perhaps it should. But the Georgian people tend to be much more anti-Russian and much more pro-Western. Conversely, Armenia is in many ways a client state of Russia. They're increasingly trying to pull out of that position. But the fundamental relationship, as I've been establishing so far, is that Armenia exists primarily because Russia created an Armenian majority there, and Russia has really been the only country that has consistently said that they will protect Armenia. Armenia is hard to access for Western countries, and often not geostrategically valuable. Whereas Azerbaijan, its foremost enemy right now, has petroleum, which is incredibly useful to most Western countries. So as we get to Nagorno-Karabakh, we are in a situation where we have increasing problems between the different ethnic groups. And the way the Soviets seek to deal with this problem is to send in military forces to evacuate Armenians from problem areas called Operation Ring. And this was one of Gorbachev's last acts as Soviet premier. And it was not well received by pretty much anybody. The military convoys provoked increased sympathy for Armenians who were being pushed off of their territory by the Soviet Union government, and spurned increasing calls for Armenian independence, which effectively did come. Now, as we move towards the actual violent conflict, which is in 1991, we begin to have the two sides sort of level themselves out. Now, the first thing that we have to understand is that Armenia, by and large, tried to at least keep a fictive separation between itself and the Artsakis, because if Armenia were to directly engage Azerbaijan in war, as opposed to the Artsakis engaging them in war, it would stop being a domestic Azerbaijani conflict, and it would be a conflict against Armenia, which would put all of Armenia at risk. But that said, there was significant crossover in arms, there was significant crossover in personnel between the Armenians and the Artsakis. One particular way in which the Artsakis benefited was the exposure that a number of them had had during the Soviet wars in Afghanistan. Now, the Soviet Union had been in Afghanistan from 1979 until 1989. And that war had created a number of well-trained military officers among the Armenian and Artsakhi populations. Azerbaijan did not have the same kind of military background or success. So the fundamental issue that okay, so oh, that's weird. So the fundamental issue when it came to battle expertise is that despite the fact that the Soviet Union had built a naval academy in Azerbaijan, they were not terribly knowledgeable in how to actually fight or win a war. That said, the Azerbaijanis came into the war with much more military equipment than the Artsakis had, which put them at what would theoretically be an advantage. However, the much more seasoned skill of the Armenians was immediately apparent, starting in 1991, with the exception of some minor counteroffensives. The Azerbaijanis lost nearly every engagement in that war. And during the conflict, Artsakh declared independence as a unique entity. And you can actually see from their flag that it is an Armenian flag with a white cut in it, basically indicating that they are sort of the Armenians that are cut off by a small separation from the rest of Armenia. A number of the leaders tried to negotiate. For example, in the Zhelezny Vod negotiations in September of 1991, designed at trying to create ceasefires between the different groups and to establish some kind of long-term settlement for the Artsakis, but by and large, these kinds of settlements did not work. And in support of Azerbaijan, Armenia closed its border with, Turkey closed its border with Armenia to prevent weapons from getting to Armenia that would end up in the hands of Artsakis. One of the things that shows how pliable this fictive separation between Armenia and Artsakh was is that in many cases, like for example, in the negotiations, President Terpetrosyan of Armenia was representing the interests of the Artsakhis in these negotiations with Ayaz Mutalibov, the leader of Azerbaijan at the time. Now, during the actual start of violence in 1991, the Azerbaijanis were based in a number of different depots and cities, one of them being Khojale, from which they launched numerous missiles at Stepanakert, which was the Artsakhi capital city. The Artsakhis decided to retaliate by taking the city, and when they took the city, they massacred the population inside. Now, there are different counts of how many people died at Khojale. The Armenian count is around 100. The Azerbaijani count is around 613. Different historians estimate different numbers, most of them settling on something in the 400s. These were large-scale targeted killings of men, women, and children, many of whom were not involved directly in the conflict, in order to secure the town and the airbase close to it. The victory of the Armenians at Khojale and the attendant massacre spelled doom for Ayaz Mutalibov. We'll talk more about that situation in a bit, and created a fundamental switch in government in Azerbaijan. Now, Mutalibov had been a Soviet through and through, and in fact, there were votes throughout 1990 as to whether the various countries in the Caucasus would remain part of the Soviet Union. Georgia and Armenia were opposed and were seeking independence. Azerbaijan, under Mutalibov, was in favor of it. His successor, Elchibey, Abulfaz Elchibey, was not one of those who was in favor of continued integration with the Soviet Union. In fact, he did a complete 180 relative to where Mutalibov had been. Elchibey decided to embrace a strong sense of Azerbaijani nationalism, and that was a nationalism that would enhance the relationship between Azerbaijan and Turkey, would weaken the relationship between Azerbaijan and Russia, and also weaken the relationship between Azerbaijan and Iran, since in many ways Elchibey encouraged the Iranian Azerbaijanis to revolt against Iran and join his Azerbaijan. Unfortunately for Elchibey, there simply weren't enough. Turkey in the 1990s was not the Turkey of today, capable of projecting this neo-Ottomanism that greatly assisted them during the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War in 2020. Turkey in the 1990s was a much more haphazard state. We've talked about that 3 weeks ago when we talked about things like the Susurluk incident, the 90s, where President Demirel and Prime Minister Tansu Çiller, this entire period where Turkey was facing large-scale inflation. The 90s were not good to Turkey, and so Turkey could not help Elchibey in the way that he needed them to against the Armenians. That said, 1992 was a difficult winter going into 1993. The Azerbaijanis were able to cut off large-scale supplies of oil and gas, both to Artsakh and to Armenia more broadly, which meant that became cold and hungry up in the mountains. Despite this, however, the Armenians were able to make serious territorial gains, like taking the Lachin corridor in May of 1992, and even being able to secure areas to the north of that, like Kalbajar, later in the year. So you also see the Artsakis taking derelict Azerbaijani equipment, retooling it, and trying to use it against the Azerbaijanis, given the disparities in technology. And the war became increasingly one that Artsakh was winning over the Azerbaijanis. In 1994, the war would end primarily in the Artsakhi's favor, resulting in a large state that would occupy a significant percentage of territory that was formerly Azerbaijani directly, and which the Armenians ethnically cleansed, as well, but not including all of the former territory of Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast, such as the region of Shahumian, which remained under Azerbaijani control. So we should understand that the Karabakh War didn't just affect whether Artsakh would be independent and those Armenians could continue to live under their own aegis, but it actually had profound political effects within the territory of Azerbaijan itself. And we need to understand all these different issues that led to the current government of the Aliyevs. So when Azerbaijan starts distancing itself from the Soviet Union, that occurs under Ayaz Mutalibov. And Mutalibov, as I mentioned, was a member of the Soviet intelligentsia. In fact, he was part of the nomenklatura. And the nomenklatura is the high-ranking Soviet aristocracy, I guess we can call them. And they are insinuated in a number of businesses. These are, for example, the oligarchs that we often hear about in Russia or in Ukraine. And throughout the various different Soviet client states, these nomenklatura had an incredible amount of power behind them. And so Mutalibov's position was to take a pro-Soviet stance, one that, considering the fact that Russia was arming the Armenians in a way that they were not arming the Azerbaijanis, or at least that was the perception within Azerbaijan, the defeat at Khojale and the attendant massacre forced him to resign to avoid a public mob from the People's Front. And the People's Front put in power Alpufaz Elchibey, which I mentioned had this much more pro-Western, pro-Turkish outlook, moving away from Russia and Iran towards a strong Azerbaijani nationalism. So swinging from supporting the nomenklatura and having this incredibly Soviet-style post-Soviet country, now we've moved to the complete other side, where we have a country that's trying to look forward to the West and disdain all Soviet institutions. But because Turkey couldn't provide for Azerbaijan, and Elchibey's military acumen resulted in the deaths of numerous Azerbaijani soldiers, Sudet Husseinov, who was a military general in the Azerbaijani army, threatened to launch a coup at Elchibey and overthrew the government. Somebody's asking if the audio is still working. Can somebody respond to him in the comments if they can hear me? Okay, thanks. So Sudet Husseinov starts marching from Ganja towards Baku, and then Elchibey just literally disappears somewhere between the 4th and 15th of June in 1993. Elchibey takes a secret flight to Turkey and escapes Azerbaijan, leading to Husseinov meeting with Haydar Aliyev. You can see in that black and white picture, Husseinov is the man sort of to the center right with a disgruntled look on his face, and Haydar Aliyev is on the left, looking on the diagonal with a rather large head. Haydar Aliyev is able to take power with Husseinov's approval. And that approval resulted in the creation of the Yeni Azerbaijan Partisi, or the New Azerbaijani Party. And that political party has been the party in political power in Azerbaijan since that point. And Haydar Aliyev wanted to reorient the politics of Azerbaijan again. So instead of taking the position that Mutalibov had taken of completely disregarding Azerbaijani nationalism, he took the position that he would support an Azerbaijani country that would be independent of Russia and seeking its own path. And like Elchibey, he was willing to reach out to Turkey, but he wasn't going to take such a strong Azerbaijan nationalist perspective. He wanted to improve relations on all sides, especially with Russia and with Iran. And so he began to reach out to those countries as well. He also tried to improve relations with the United States. So Haydar Aliyev's perspective would put Azerbaijan sort of in the middle. It wouldn't be in the Western camp, it wouldn't be in the Eastern camp, it would be in sort of its own camp. So what made Haydar Aliyev the right choice for Azerbaijan at this critical moment? Well, the first thing is that, and again, this breaks the barrier between Armenia and Artsakh, is that Haydar Aliyev had been the leader of the Nakhchivan autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic when that broke off. And so when Ayaz Mutalibov and Elchibey tried to force his resignation, they couldn't do because of the land border that separates him from the rest of Azerbaijan. And they also had bigger fish to fry with the Artsakhi rebellion. But he was able to maintain his position and prevent a war from breaking out with Armenia by reaching out directly to President Lev Ter-Petrosyan and signing an armistice between Nakhchivan and Armenia. And his goal was to use Russia as a mediator to help stop the hemorrhaging that was going on in Nagorno-Karabakh and begin to focus more on domestic issues within Azerbaijan. But we have to understand that Haydar Aliyev and his son Ilham, their entire mandate on power was the fact that they could undo what Mutalibov and Elchibey let happen, which is that the Artsakhi rebellion resulted in a state on what was de jure Azerbaijani territory. As part of the improvement of relations between Azerbaijan and the United States, Haydar Aliyev sent his Baku N military unit, which is a peacekeeping unit, to the United States military engagements in both Iraq and in Afghanistan, trying to play sort of a more neutral role than probably would have been charted, especially by Mutalibov. One of the ways that he was able to court Russia and rebuild the relationship with Russia was by reinstituting the nomenclatura in many respects. Many of those individuals were reintegrated into a new Azerbaijani bureaucracy that was freer than it had been during the Soviet period, but significantly more restricted than it had been during the Elchibey years. And this resulted in a very corrupt organizing system within Azerbaijan, a system that was able to garner Haydar Aliyev a 98.7% vote when he went for his first election in November of 1993. And since then, his votes have generally been hovering around the 70% range until he died in 2003 and was succeeded by his son Ilham. Now, he also reached out to Demirel of Turkey and Shevardnadze of Georgia in order to improve the economic situation of Azerbaijan. And the easiest way for him to do that, of course, was through petroleum. So starting in 2002, there were discussions on the Tbilisi-Ceyhan, the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline, which was completed in 2009 by his son Ilham. And this pipeline circumvented Armenia in order to bring petroleum from the Caspian all the way to the Mediterranean Sea, where it could be offloaded and shipped around the world. The selling of oil resulted in Azerbaijan's economy expanding tremendously, and Azerbaijan reached out to a number of other parties in the region in order to sell its oil and facilitate the growth of its military. Remember, of course, as I said, that the Aliyevs had a right to rule based on the fact that they would restore Azerbaijani territorial integrity. And so obtaining military weapons was of prime concern. Of significantly less concern was the relationship with the Middle Eastern countries. And so they were willing to make an alliance with Israel in order to get access to Israeli military equipment. On the Artsakhi side, you had the creation of the Artsakh Republic. And Artsakh is a sort of strange situation in the post-Soviet space. Not that the other post-Soviet republics don't have this, but because Artsakh was not a governing apparatus that existed, it is not a successor to the Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast. It's made of a completely different set of individuals. And it is significantly less corrupt and less Sovietized than a lot of the former Soviet states because the nomenclatura never had a time to develop. And accordingly, the corruption index, at least prior to the Nagorno-Karabakh 2020 war in 2020, was significantly better than Armenia, Azerbaijan, or Georgia. The parliament is routinely elected. Ararik Harutyunyan, who was the president starting in 2020, is the fourth person to hold the role. And human rights are generally well respected, assuming you're an Armenian. Artsakh tried to develop an economy based primarily around tourism, which is incredibly difficult given the fact that no country recognizes Artsakh, not even Armenia. But Armenia and Artsakh do maintain roads, or at least did maintain roads that connected them. One through the city of Lachin, which is the closest point between Armenia and the Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast. One of these existed from 2017 until 2020, and another one existed from 2019 until 2020 in order to connect the two countries. And in fact, politically, the countries are very connected. Both of Armenia's two former presidents, Armenia has had three presidents, Robert Kocharyan and Serge Sargsyan, are Karabakhtis, are Artsakhis, who became presidents of Armenia after their war experience in the Karabakh Wars. Now, this might seem relatively surprising because these are individuals who fought in the military of a foreign country, were born in a foreign country, and are now presidents of Armenia. But in the minds of many Armenians, there's no real difference between an Artsakhi and an Armenian because they're both ethnically Armenians, two homelands divided by political happenstance. And so the movement of people between the two countries occurs relatively freely, or at least from an ideological perspective, occurs relatively freely. We also mentioned that Artsakh was one of the few territories that Armenians had long-standing governance in, which results in numerous different monasteries and historic locations throughout Artsakh, which are places that Armenians, both from the Republic of Armenia and Armenians in the diaspora, came to Artsakh to see. For example, Ganzasar Monastery, which is very famous for actually having a sculpture of Jalaluddin, who was the founder of the Armenian dynasty that controlled the Khachen over 800 years ago. And of course, there are also modern sites that were created to facilitate people coming, such as such as the We Are Our Mountains monument that you can see below, symbolizing the Armenians' connection to their mountains in Artsakh. We can also see that Armenia plays a critical role in Azerbaijani threats or negotiations. Armenia during this period, in the post-Karabakh War period, generally had a relatively laggard economy and high unemployment. The one thing that Armenia really does have that it can export is energy. They have a nuclear plant that's left over from the Soviet period in the city of Metsamor, which is in the western part of Armenia, very far from Artsakh, but Azerbaijan has threatened that if Armenia directly intervenes on behalf of the Artsakhis in conflict, that they will launch missiles at Metsamor, which has led Armenians to point out that this evinces the genocidal intent of the Azerbaijanis. Azerbaijan, of course, one of the only countries, along with Turkey, that denies the Armenian genocide. All right, so we are at the witching hour. So the rest of this presentation I will do next week. So questions, comments, curiosities, please put those in the chat. And while I'm waiting, I will tell you a little bit about our group. Oh, that's new. This is History Mostly Ancient Discussions. I am Richard, and you have been listening to Middle Eastern Islamic History. Next week, we will finish our discussion on the modern Caucasus, and we will then talk about Afghanistan starting from the 1960s or so. We also have other groups like Asian philosophy, European Union security, Greco-Roman civilization, all kinds of really great series. And I implore you to go to our YouTube page in order to see some of our older series and our short run series. Apparently, we're going to need a new Russo-Ukrainian series now that somebody got on a plane that he shouldn't have. But any questions, comments, concerns? If I'm looking at the untitled poll, name a first Georgian president stood up to Russia, I actually would have put a different answer than the three that are listed there, because it's Kikabidze, Jugashvili, and Saakashvili. Jugashvili is actually Joseph Stalin, but the answer I would have put there was Zviad Gamsakhurdia, who you can see over there. That's the answer that I would have put, because Gamsakhurdia was a Georgian nationalist back in 1990, and he braved Soviet tanks sent by the Russians in order to try and create Georgia as an independent country. And he would have kept that power, but for a military coup coordinated by the Nomenklatura to oust him and put Shevardnadze in power. And Shevardnadze was in turn replaced by Saakashvili. So I would actually go with that. There's a question of do you think Russia was correct in defending Abkhazia and invading Georgia? Russia invaded Georgia from Abkhazia, but the start of the war was actually Georgian aggression on Ossetia. The Georgians were trying to retake the region of Ossetia and bring it back into Georgia, because part of Saakashvili's mandate, similar to the mandate of the Aliyevs in Azerbaijan was the idea that Ukraine should be territorially integrated. And while there may be some room for Georgians to accept that the Abkhaz have a legitimate place where they are, for many Georgians, the Ossetians are more recent immigrants, and therefore, and we'll get into this when we talk about it more next week, therefore don't really have a place in Georgia, and their autonomous oblast should be canceled. And then the wars with Chechnya. There was the war in 91, the war in 94. I think there was a war in 97 or 98. And of course, there's the struggle, there's the fights like the attack on the school in Beslan that was done by Chechens, and then there's Russian retaliation, and all these things until the Kadyrovs come to power in Chechnya and basically turn Chechnya into a Russian vassal state that's mostly independent, but for the fact that the Kadyrovs acknowledge Putin's power. All right, any other comments, questions, concerns? All right, then. If that's the case, I'll see everybody next week. And thank you, everybody, for coming.